In June of 2026, on a stage in Utah, an 81-year-old man gripped the microphone stand a little too tightly. Rod Stewart had sung for 60 years. He had outlasted trends, critics, and the deaths of friends. But on this night, something was wrong. His breath was short. Backstage, before he could finish, he needed an oxygen tank. And then, rather than walk away, he went back out and finished the concert sitting down. Think about that image for a second. One of the great showmen of the rock era, the man who once strutted across stadiums like the floor belonged to him, now sitting in a chair, pushing air into his lungs, refusing to stop. The body was finally asking a question it had never asked before. How much longer? And when a man like Rod Stewart starts running out of time, you find out what he was really building all those years. Not the records, not the 250 million albums sold. You find out who is waiting for him when the lights go down. The answer is complicated. Rod Stewart has 8 children, born to 5 different women, across nearly 50 years of his life. The oldest was born when he was 17, and he gave her away. The youngest was born when he was 66, and he tucked him into bed himself. Between those two extremes lies one of the most complicated fatherhood stories in the history of popular music. So here's the question this story is really about, the one that divides people who have lived long enough to know how families actually work. Was Rod Stewart there when it mattered? Or was he only there once it became easy? Because there's a daughter who was given away before it made a single record. A daughter who grew up learning what her father looked like from a poster on her bedroom wall. And her story is where we have to begin. For most of his life, the world knew exactly who Rod Stewart was. The spiky hair, the raspy voice that sounded like it had been dragged over gravel and somehow came out beautiful. The leopard print, the football scarves, the champagne, the swagger of a man who seemed genuinely convinced that the party would never end. He was rock and roll's great libertine, the cheerful rogue, the man who wrote, "Do you think I'm sexy?" and clearly did. That was the public Rod Stewart, and it was not an act. He lived it fully for decades, but it was never the whole story. Because running underneath all that noise, quiet and largely unseen, was a second life. A tangled, sprawling, often painful story of children and the women who bore them, of absences and reunions, of a man who kept becoming a father while he was busy becoming a legend. And here's the part that makes it more than just another tale of a distracted celebrity. Rod Stewart was not a man who had never seen good fathering up close. He had. He grew up inside it. He was raised by a father who was present, steady, and devoted in a warm and stable working-class home where nobody had much money, but nobody doubted they were loved. Rod Stewart knew exactly what a good father looked like because he had one. So the question at the heart of this story is not simply how a famous man drifted away from his children. It is stranger and more human than that. It is this: how does a man who was raised by a genuinely good father find it so hard to become one himself? How does someone who knew what home felt like spend the first half of his life running away from it, and the second half desperately trying to build it again? To understand that, we have to start not with Rod, but with the man who raised him. Roderick David Stewart was born on January 10th, 1945, in Highgate, North London, the youngest of 5 children. He arrived at the tail end of the Second World War, the baby of the family, doted on by older siblings and by 2 parents who ran an ordinary, hard-working, close-knit household. His father, Robert Stewart, was a master builder of Scottish descent who later ran a newsagent's shop. There was no money to speak of, but there was something a lot of children never get, and it would shape everything about how Rod understood family for the rest of his life. There was a father who was there. Robert Stewart was the anchor of that home. By every account Rod has ever given, his father was the steady center of the family, a man who worked hard, provided what he could, and showed up. And crucially, Robert loved two things that he passed directly to his youngest son: football and music. It was Rod's father and older brothers who put a football at his feet and made him a lifelong, fanatical supporter. And it was his father who, when Rod was a teenager, bought him his first guitar. Sit with that for a moment, because it is a quiet engine of this entire story. The gift that set Rod Stewart on the path to fame, the guitar, the encouragement, the belief that his boy might make something of music, came from his father. Robert Stewart did the most loving thing a working-class dad could do. He looked at his restless youngest son, and he said, in effect, go chase it. Go be more than this street, this shop, this ordinary life. And Rod did. He chased it further than anyone could have imagined. But here is the ache buried inside that gift. The very thing Robert gave his son out of love, the music, the ambition, the permission to leave, was a thing that would eventually pull Rod away from his own children. The father's love became the son's escape hatch. Robert Stewart raised a boy in a home where the father was always present, and that boy grew up to become a father who was almost never there. Not because he rejected what his father taught him, but because a dream his father blessed him to chase demanded a life of perpetual motion, and you cannot be in a recording studio in Los Angeles and at a bedside in London at the same time. Rod adored his father. When Robert Stewart died in 1990, Rod was devastated, and he has spoken since about how much of his own sense of family, loyalty, and steadiness came from that man, which makes the central puzzle of his life all the sharper. He had the blueprint. He had lived inside a good father's house. He knew in his bones what it felt like to have a dad who stayed. And still, when his own children came, one after another across the decades, he could not do the one thing his father had done so effortlessly. He could not stay. That is not a story about a bad man. It is a story about how fame can take even someone who knows better and pull him away from the very thing he values most. Rod Stewart spent his childhood in a home built on his father's presence. He would spend his adulthood learning, the hard way, how much that presence had actually been worth. In the 1960s, Rod took his father's blessing and ran with it. He kicked around the London music scene, busking, singing in clubs, sleeping rough at times, learning his trade the hard way. He joined the Jeff Beck Group in 1967, and then became the frontman of the Faces alongside his lifelong friend Ronnie Wood, all while launching a solo career that would soon eclipse everything. By 1971, an album called Every Picture Tells a Story and a song called Maggie May turned him from a working musician into a genuine star. The voice was unmistakable. The persona was irresistible. Rod Stewart had arrived. But here's what fame gave Rod Stewart, and it is the key to everything that follows. It gave him a life built entirely around motion. Touring meant he was always leaving. Success meant there was always another city, another studio, another party, another continent. The very thing that made him a star, that restless, roving, insatiable appetite for the next thing, was the exact opposite of what it takes to raise a child. A rock star's life rewards a man who never stops moving. A father's life rewards a man who stays. And Rod Stewart, for the first half of his life, had built a career that made staying almost impossible. He would later put it more bluntly than any critic ever could. Looking back on the years when his first son and daughter with Alana were small, he admitted that he had simply missed a huge chunk of their childhood. He confessed in an interview that his touring had cost him roughly 5 years of Sean and Kimberly's early lives. 5 years. Gone. Not taken by tragedy or illness, but by choice, by schedule, by the relentless forward motion of a career that always wanted him somewhere else. He said it with regret, as a man who had eventually done the math and understood the price. That is the cruel arithmetic of fame, and Rod Stewart lived it more completely than almost anyone. Everything his father had given him, the music, the drive, the permission to dream bigger than his circumstances, paid off beyond any reasonable expectation. He got the stardom. He got the wealth. He got the adoration of millions. And the bill for all of it, quietly, was presented to his children. The man raised by a father who never left became a father who was always leaving. But before the mansions, before Alana and the private jets and the missed 5 years, before any of the fame his father had blessed him to chase, there was a broke 17-year-old boy in London who was about to become a father for the very first time. And he would handle it in a way that would haunt him longest of all. Her name is Sarah. And for the first 18 years of her life, she had no idea that the famous man on her bedroom wall was her father. Go back to the early 1960s. Rod Stewart is nobody yet. He is a teenager in London, broke, long-haired, drifting between causes and gigs, a boy with guitar his father bought him, and no evidence yet that would ever amount to anything. At a political demonstration, he meets a young art student named Susanna Buffy. She is bohemian, bright, part of the same restless London youth culture he belongs to. They date for a little over a year, and Susanna becomes pregnant. On November 6, 1963, she gives birth to a daughter. Rod Stewart is 17 years old. Now think honestly about what that meant for a 17-year-old in Britain in 1963. He had nothing. No money, no career, no home of his own, no earthly way to support child. Years later, he would describe the situation with characteristic bluntness, saying they gave the baby up because the two of them did not have, in his words, a pot to relieve themselves in. It was not a cruel decision. It was a frightened one made by two kids with no options at a time when an unmarried teenage pregnancy carried enormous shame and almost no support. Rod wanted the baby placed for adoption. Susanna tried for a few months to raise the little girl on her own. And then, struggling and alone, she agreed. But here's the part that is harder to hear, the part that complicates any clean version of the story. The baby was not simply handed to a loving family and given a fresh start. She spent the first years of her life in and out of children's homes and foster care. She was not adopted permanently until she was 5 years old, finally taken in by a couple named Gerald and Evelyn Thubron, who gave her a name, a home, and the stable childhood her biological parents could not. Sarah Streeter grew up loved, at last. But those first 5 years, the shuffling, the waiting, the impermanence, happened to a real child while her biological father was beginning to chase the dream his own father had blessed. And Sarah grew up not knowing any of it. She was raised as a Thubron's daughter, an ordinary English girl. Like millions of others in the 1970s, she knew Rod Stewart only as a rock star, a voice on the radio, a face in the charts. In one of the most heartbreaking small details in this entire story, she has said that as a teenager, she had a poster of him on her wall because she thought he was handsome. She was, without knowing it, pinning up a picture of her own father because she had a crush on a pop star. Then, when she turned 18, her adoptive parents told her the truth. Imagine absorbing that. The famous man you admired, the sex symbol on your bedroom wall, is your father. She has described how impossible it was to take in, how she kept insisting there must be hundreds of men named Rod Stewart. Surely it could not be the Rod Stewart. But it was. She decided she wanted to meet him. And this is where the story turns genuinely painful, because the first attempt at a reunion, back in the 1980s, did not go the way anyone hoping for a fairy tale would want. By then, Rod was one of the most famous men on the planet, and the meeting was awkward, guarded, and cold. Sarah has spoken about it with devastating honesty. She felt he had only agreed to see her under pressure. Her mother had wondered aloud whether he might hug her. He did not. In her own words, she came away feeling like a fan, not like someone who shared his blood. She would later say, with real bitterness at the time, that she almost wished she had never gone looking for him at all. And Rod, for his part, did not exactly cover himself in glory in those years. When asked publicly how many children he had, he was capable of a throwaway line about Sarah, something to the effect of, "You can count her if you want." Read that sentence and feel how it must have landed on a young woman still trying to understand where she came from. For roughly 2 decades after that first failed meeting, father and daughter had almost no contact at all. She was functionally the child he kept forgetting he had, and she carried that, like her half-brother Sean would in his own way. Sarah went through her own dark stretch in those years, a period of real struggle she would later have to climb out of. The children on the outer edges of Rod Stewart's fame did not always find it easy to grow up whole. So, for a long time, this looked like a story with no redemption in it. A daughter given away, a botched reunion, 20 years of silence, a father who could not seem to make room in his enormous life for the child who had needed him first. And then in 2007, something changed. Sarah's adoptive mother, Evelyn, the woman who had actually raised her, died. And in the space that loss opened up, Rod finally came in. Not under pressure this time. Not for the cameras. He reconnected with his firstborn daughter properly, at last, and this time held. Sarah put it in a way that says everything about what had been missing before. She said that Rod had come into her life in a big way once her mother was gone, and that she did not think that was a coincidence. It was as though, with the parent who raised her gone, there was finally room for the parent who had given her up. What they built after that was not a fairy tale, and it is important not to pretend otherwise. You cannot unlive 40 years. He had not changed her diapers, or walked her to school, or helped with her homework, and he knew it. He said as much, admitting how strange and hard one it was to simply begin calling each other father and daughter after so long. But they did begin. She got to know her half-siblings. She became, finally, part of the sprawling family she had watched from the outside for most of her life. And Rod, the man who was so rarely able to say the hard things directly, did what he has always done best. He put it in a song. On his 2013 album, he included a track called Brighton Beach, a wistful ballad about his first love, Susanna, and the daughter they had lost at adoption. It was his apology, his grief, and his confession, set to music, the way a man like Rod Stewart says the things he cannot say out loud. So ask yourself, before we go any further, where do we even start counting Rod Stewart's life as a father? Do we start with the mansions and the private jets? Or do we start here, on November 6, 1963, with a 17-year-old boy and a baby girl he would not truly know for another 44 years? Because Sarah was the first test of fatherhood Rod Stewart was ever given, and by any honest measure, he failed it. The question that haunts the rest of the story is whether a man can fail that badly at the beginning and still, somehow, find his way to something better by the end. Sarah was the first thing fame could not fix. The rest of his life would be spent finding out how many of the others he could. By the time Rod Stewart had his next children, everything had changed except the one thing that mattered most. He was no longer a penniless teenager. He was one of the most famous men in the world. And yet, in the way that counted, he was still absent. In 1979, he married the American actress and model Alana Hamilton. 2 children came fast. Kimberly, born in August of 1979, and Sean, born in September of 1980. These were the children of Rod Stewart at his absolute commercial peak. The Do You Think I'm Sexy? Years, the era of private jets and world tours, and a life running flat out. And so Kimberly and Sean grew up inside the paradox that the children of the very famous know too well. They had access to everything and the actual presence of almost nothing. A father who was adored by millions and available to them mostly in the gaps. Rod himself, years later, named the cause with unusual precision. He looked back and realized he had missed something like 5 years of Kimberly and Sean's early childhood, simply because he was touring, always somewhere else. That is a confession of a man who eventually understood exactly what his fame had charged to his children's account. The marriage to Alana ended in 1984, and the kids grew up shuttling between worlds, rich in everything but the ordinary daily presence of their dad. You can see what that inheritance cost most clearly in Sean. Rod's oldest son moved through a turbulent young adulthood that played out publicly, a long, difficult stretch of trouble and struggle the kind of children of fame are far too likely to face. It would be too neat to draw a straight line from an absent father to a son who lost his way. Life is more tangled than that. But it would be dishonest to pretend the two had nothing to do with each other. What matters, and what redeems this chapter, is that Sean eventually found his way back, and that as both men aged, father and son repaired what had frayed. Sean came home too. It just took years, and it cost him to get there. Then came the children of the middle chapters, each arriving inside a different relationship, a different version of Rod. Ruby, born in 1987 to the model Kelly and Berg, would grow up to become a singer herself, inheriting her father's stage instinct so completely that decades later she would stand beside him in front of a live audience and trade verses with him. Renee, born in 1992, and Liam, born in 1994, came during his marriage to the New Zealand model Rachel Hunter. They were still young when that marriage collapsed in the late 1990s. Another split, another set of children learning to love a father across distance and division. Look at the shape of it. Kimberly and Sean from one marriage. Ruby from another relationship. Renee and Liam from the next. Different mothers, different homes, different decades. A family tree branching in every possible direction. For any child, that is a complicated thing to be born into. It means sharing your father not only with the public, but with a whole web of half-siblings and other households and other versions of the man. Without ever quite deciding to, Rod Stewart had built one of the most scattered families in show business, and for a long time it looked like it might stay that way permanently. 8 children who might never all stand in the same room. To understand how that scattering happened, you have to understand what fame actually demanded of Rod Stewart, because it is easy to judge from the outside and much harder to sit honestly with the trade he was making. Fame gave Rod everything the boy from Highgate could have dreamed of. Money his father never had. Freedom to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone. The adoration of stadiums full of strangers. It was a full, dazzling payoff of the dream Robert Stewart had blessed the son to chase. But fame does not hand you those things for free. It extracts a price, and the currency it demands is presence. To stay famous at Rod's level, you have to keep moving. Another tour, another album, another country, a life organized entirely around leaving. And each of the women in his life caught a different version of the man that life produced. Alana Hamilton got young Rod at his most reckless and self-absorbed, a superstar husband who was gone as often as he was home. Kelly and Berg, and then Rachel Hunter got the Rod of the high-velocity middle years, still moving too fast to fully land anywhere, still treating home as a place he returned to between the things that really held his attention. None of these relationships failed because Rod was a monster. They struggled because he was, for most of his life, a man who did not know how to stop. The relationships reflected the man, and the man was built for motion. Here is the honest heart of it, the thing that keeps this from being a simple morality tale. Rod Stewart was never a cruel or neglectful father, in the way those words usually mean. He did not abandon his children to hardship. He gave them the opposite of what he had grown up with, financial security beyond imagining, homes and schools and comfort. But there is an enormous difference between providing for a child and being present for one, and it is a difference money cannot close. His own father had almost no money and gave Rod the one thing that mattered, which was himself every day. Rod gave his children everything except that. The father raised on presence without wealth became a father who offered wealth without presence. He had somehow inherited the exact opposite of what he had been given. The young Rod would have told you, if he was honest, that he needed to keep moving. That the next city, the next stage, the next song was where life actually happened. For 50 years, if you had forced him to choose between the spotlight and the living room, the spotlight would have won almost every time. The question, the one that makes the rest of his life worth watching, is whether a man built that completely for leaving can ever truly learn to stay. And the answer arrived unexpectedly in 1999. Her name is Penny Lancaster. She was a photographer, tall and striking, 26 years younger than Rod. They met in 1999, when he was already in his mid-50s, already a grandfather several times over, already a man whose romantic history read like a tabloid archive. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of thing Rod Stewart had done a dozen times before. Another beautiful younger woman. Another chapter in an endless series. It was not that. It turned out to be the thing that finally changed him. They got engaged in 2005 and married in 2007 in a lavish ceremony in Portofino on the Italian coast. And this time, what came after the glamour was different, because this was where Rod's relationships had always fallen apart before, and this one did not. They renewed their vows in 2017. They are still together now, more than 26 years after they met. In a life defined by departure, Penny Lancaster became the person Rod Stewart finally stopped leaving. And with her came the second act of his fatherhood, an act that looks almost nothing like the first. In November of 2005, Penny gave birth to a son, Alistair. In February of 2011, when Rod was 66 years old, she gave birth to another, Aiden. Think about that. At an age when most men are eased into being grandfathers, Rod Stewart was starting over from the beginning. Diapers, school runs, bedtimes, the whole ordinary, unglamorous, day-after-day machinery of raising small children, the exact machinery he had skipped the first time around. And this time, by every account, he did it differently. This was not the touring star swooping in between shows. This was an older man who had finally slowed down enough to actually be there, coaching his young son's football, doing the school run, present for the ordinary 1,000 nights he had missed with the others. He has spoken about how different it feels to raise children when you are no longer trying to conquer the world at the same time. And there's a detail from all the way back in 1995 that shows he had seen this coming, that the guilt had been working on him for years. Talking about the 5 years he lost with Sean and Kimberly, he said that with his younger children, he had resolved not to make that mistake again, that he now took them with him so he could actually watch them grow up. He had learned the lesson. It had simply taken him decades and a second family to fully act on it, but feel the ache buried inside the happy ending. Because if you were one of the older children, you got to watch your father become, in the 70s, the devoted, ever-present dad you had longed for when you were small. Sarah, given away at birth. Sean, struggling in the glare of the spotlight. Kimberly, Ruby, Renee, Liam, all raised in the era of the leaving. And then Alistair and Aiden, raised by a man who would finally figure out how to stay. Same father, different men. The question that divides people who have lived long enough to know how families work is whether arriving late is the same as arriving too late. Whether the father who finally learned to come home did it in time to matter to the ones he had kept waiting the longest. And then, against all odds, they all came home. In May of 2024, Rod Stewart's son Liam got married in Croatia. And for that wedding, something happened that would have seemed impossible in the scattered decades before. All 8 of Rod Stewart's children, born to 5 different women across more than 40 years, came together in one place. Sarah, the daughter he gave away in 1963 and did not truly know until 2007. Kimberly and Sean, the children of his commercial peak. Ruby, Renee, and Liam, the children of the middle years. Alistair and Aiden, the sons of his late life second chance. 8 people who represented every chapter, every relationship, every version of man, standing together as a single family. Think about what it actually takes to build that. Not the money. The money was always there. What it takes is a harder thing. The years of slow repair, the phone calls, the apologies, the showing up, the willingness of 8 people to forgive a father's long absences and choose to be a family anyway. That reunion in Croatia did not happen because Rod Stewart was famous. It happened because, somewhere in his later years, he finally did the quiet work of becoming someone his children wanted to gather around. And then came the moment the world actually saw. At the 2025 American Music Awards, Rod Stewart was given a Lifetime Achievement Award. 5 of his children walked onto the stage to present it to him. And the look on his face was not the practiced grin of a star collecting one more trophy. It was shock. It was disbelief. It was the face of a man who could not quite believe that after everything, after all the years he was somewhere else, they had shown up for him in front of the whole world. But here is what makes this story urgent rather than merely sentimental, and it brings us back to where we began. Because that same man, 1 year later, in June of 2026, was on a stage in Utah, short of breath, reaching for oxygen, finishing the show in a chair. The body that carried him through 60 years of relentless motion is finally slowing down. He has said the big touring may end after one last run. The health scares have started. The time for coming home is no longer unlimited, which is exactly why the family he built, so late and so imperfectly and against such long odds, matters now more than any record he ever made. So we come back to the question we started with. Was Rod Stewart there when it mattered? Or was he only there once it became easy? And maybe the honest answer is that he was both men, and that the truth of him lives in the long, painful distance between the two. For the first half of his life, he was a father who was always leaving. The 17-year-old who gave a daughter away because he had nothing. The superstar who missed 5 years of 2 children's lives and admitted it. The man who, raised by a father who never left, somehow became a father who was almost never there. That was real. It cannot be erased, and the people who paid for it, most of all Sarah, deserve to have it named honestly. But the other half is real too. The older man who finally stopped running, who coached football and did the school runs and tucked his youngest sons into bed himself, who reconnected with a long-lost daughter after her adoptive mother died and finally, at long last, learned to call her his own, who did the slow, unglamorous work of repairing what he'd let fracture, one phone call and one apology at a time, until 8 scattered children from 5 different mothers could stand together at a wedding in Croatia and simply be a family. And here's the detail that holds the whole story together. Back in 1988, long before any of that healing, Rod Stewart wrote a song called Forever Young. For years, people assumed it was just another hit. But Rod has said what it really was. It was a father's prayer for his children, written out of the guilt of a man who knew he was missing their childhoods, a wish that the kids he kept leaving would grow up strong and happy despite him. He wrote it as an apology. He did not yet know how to live. And then, decades later, life did something almost unbearably fitting. At the 2025 American Music Awards, an 80-year-old Rod Stewart stood on that stage and sang Forever Young as his own children walked out to honor him. The apology had become a homecoming. The song he wrote out of guilt for the childhoods he missed was now the soundtrack to the moment his children chose, in front of the world, to stand beside him anyway. And earlier that same year, his daughter Ruby had joined him on stage in Texas to sing that very song with him. 2 voices, father and daughter, trading the lines of a wish he had made for her when she was small. After a lifetime of sold-out stadiums, #1 records, and every honor the music industry could hand him, Rod Stewart's greatest achievement may turn out to be the quietest one. Not the fame his father blessed him to chase. Not the 250 million albums. But the fact that a man who spent his youth learning how to be seen by the whole world spent his old age learning how to be seen by the handful of people who actually needed him. He learned, far too late, but not too late, how to come home. Now we want to hear from you, because this is a story people genuinely disagree about. Do you think Rod Stewart made up for the years he was gone? Or do some absences come too late to ever fully repair? Was he a good father who simply arrived late? Or a man who only learned how to be one when the running finally stopped? There is no easy answer, and we suspect the comments will not agree. Tell us where you land. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the fathers in your own life, the ones who stayed, the ones who came home late, and the ones who never quite made it back, take a moment to leave a like. It tells us these stories are worth telling. Subscribe for more of the real lives behind the famous faces. And before you go, tell us what city you are watching from tonight. Because somewhere out there, someone is sitting with this very story, thinking about their own family, and there is something powerful in knowing you are not watching alone.